What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to some more tips and tricks for the Canon EOS R5. In this video, I'm going to look at the settings found on the Custom Functions 2 menu page. Why Custom Functions 2? Well, why not? Though in all seriousness, I actually just wanted to talk about the Restrict Shooting Mode setting, but I didn't feel that was enough to warrant a whole video, and I couldn't figure out what else to combine it with that made a lot of sense. So let's just dive in and see how this goes. First up at the top of the page is the setting for same exposure for new aperture. And this is definitely a niche feature with a niche use case, so much so that while I've changed the setting on my camera, I'm still not exactly sure how useful it actually is. The point of this feature is to maintain the same exposure when shooting in manual mode when you change a lens that causes the aperture that you were using to no longer be available. So as an example, maybe you were shooting with a 50 f1.2L at f2, and you changed to a 70 to 200 f2.8. Well, the new lens forces a slower aperture setting. It just can't do f2. And normally this would result in a darker exposure, since the shutter speed and the ISO are presumably under the meter's control when you're shooting in manual mode. This feature would also kick in if you're using a variable aperture zoom, such as, for example, a 100 to 500, or adding a teleconverter, or at the other end of the spectrum, if you change lenses to a new lens that can't stop down as far as you were using your old lens at. So there are 4 options to choose from here: off, ISO, ISO/shutter speed, and shutter speed. When this setting is set to off, the change in aperture will result in a change in exposure. The camera won't mess with your ISO or shutter speed settings, and you'll have to manually correct the exposure due to the new aperture from the new lens. The second option, ISO only, will cause the camera to adjust the ISO to correct for the exposure. So if you were shooting with at f2, for example, and changed to, say, an f4 lens, the ISO will increase by 2 stops to correct for the change in exposure. If there aren't enough ISO settings to cover the change, then the camera will fix things up as best it can, but the exposure will ultimately change by what the camera can't fix. So for example, if you're shooting with a 50mm f1.8 at f1.8 and ISO 25600, and you were to switch to a 70 to 200 f4, the new max aperture is 2 1/3 stops darker than your previous lens, and there isn't enough ISO speed ranges to cover that correction. So in the end, you'll have the camera at max ISO setting, and the exposure will be 1/3 of a stop darker than it was previously. The third option uses both the ISO and shutter speed, but favors the ISO. So if the exposure shift can't be made up by just shifting the ISO alone, the camera will adjust the shutter speed as needed. Continuing with the previous example, in this mode, instead of the exposure being off by 1/3 of a stop, the extra 1/3 of a stop is made up by slowing down the shutter speed. With both of these options, the changes to the ISO the camera will make will use the entire manual ISO range that you've configured. This is not auto ISO. I've got another video looking at how to limit the ISO and auto ISO ranges, so if you're interested and you want to check that out, there's a card up there in the corner somewhere. The final option adjusts just the shutter speed only. So when push comes to shove, I really don't have any strong feelings about this setting, and I'm not going to make any recommendations. There's certainly arguments to be made for any of the options here, and how relevant this is to you is going to be dependent on how often you shoot in manual and change lenses. I've got my camera set to change the shutter speed, largely because I thought that it would be interesting to try this feature out. The shutter speed bothers me less than the ISO because of noise and dynamic range, and that's why I picked that. But this is such a niche thing for me that I've never bothered to change it back off, and I don't really even notice it. So take that as you will. Moving down the Custom Function 2 menu to the next entry is the Auto Exposure Lock Meter Mode After Focus. So normally when shooting in one-shot autofocus and using evaluative metering, when focus is achieved, the exposure is locked, and it will stay that way as long as you hold the shutter release or the AF on button. On the R5, you can control what metering modes cause this to happen beyond just evaluative. The default is evaluative metering only, which is where my camera is set, and I'm going to say you probably shouldn't change it from that. In fact, the more I think about this setting, the more confused I am over why it's here at all. In fact, in some respects, I find this is just another example of a menu item that doesn't make a lot of sense in general to me. And in some ways, I feel like this is a function that maybe was intended for an EOS 1 series camera and somehow got brought into the R series, but without all the rest of the capabilities that went with it. Why? Well, when using evaluative metering, the camera will use the active autofocus point to understand what part of the frame it should meter or weight most heavily. It assumes you're focusing on your main subject, and therefore the most important thing to get the metering right. That's the most important thing to get the metering right on. If you're focusing on a face or a leaf or whatever, and it's off-centered, the meter will adjust the exposure with more weight to that thing than the rest of the frame. If you're shooting in one-shot AF, then the camera will meter the scene, and once focus has been established, lock that exposure as long as you're holding the shutter release or it's half pressed, or you use if you use rear button focusing, the AF on button is held. So if you're shooting in one shot and evaluative metering, the camera will look at where you're focusing, weight that as the subject, and then hang on to that calculated exposure while you recompose and shoot the image. Okay, this all makes sense, at least to me. Now, sure, the need to focus and recompose is basically non-existent now that we have 100% AF coverage in our mirrorless cameras, but there's still some sense here. What about spot, partial, and center weighted average then? Well, on an EOS 1 camera, the spot meter can be tied to the active autofocus point. So it makes sense that you might want to lock the metered exposure given an off-centered AF point, since it can have an off-centered spot meter to go with it. But on the R5, the spot meter is always in the center of the frame. So you're focusing off-center, and the camera would be metering something that's not under what you're focusing on, or that's not what you're focusing on, and that just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. The same goes for partial. As for center weighted, that seems like it could go either way. It's more like evaluative than either spot or partial, but the weighting is still centralized and not intelligent. In any event, if you're using spot, partial, or center weighted, you're probably better off using the exposure lock to ensure that you're metering what you want instead of relying on this and one-shot AF to sort of lock the exposure. And then on top of that, only using the centermost AF point. With all that said, if metering on the R5 is something you'd like to see more about, then you might want to subscribe, as I've got a video coming up on that. Continuing down the functions or the custom functions menu, we get to the setting that I really wanted to talk about, but couldn't come up with enough to talk about to make a significant video on, and that's the restrict shooting modes option. So one of the nice things that comes with tracking shooting modes electronically as opposed to on a physical dial is that you can turn off the modes that you don't want or need. Restricting modes does just that. It disables those modes in that mode menu that comes up, which, obviously with as many modes as there are on the R5, I think there's 10, makes it a bit faster to scroll through the settings. If you go to enable restricted shooting modes, you'll also notice there's only 9 options, not the full 10 that the camera supports. This is a bit of a hidden feature, as Auto Plus is automatically disabled when restricted shooting modes is enabled. So on my camera, I've enabled restricted shooting modes and disabled flexible priority and program auto. I've played around with flexible priority when I first got the camera, and I just couldn't get into it. And I don't think I've ever used program auto on any camera I've ever owned. Now that I'm not saying that they're useless, but they are useless to me, and so I got rid of them. Something you can't do with a physical mode dial. The last 2 options on the Custom Functions 2 menu page similarly restrict settings, but instead of shooting modes, these restrict the minimum and maximum aperture and shutter values that you can use. I don't use these at all, as I just don't see a reason to limit the aperture shutter speed range that I can use with my camera. These came to the EOS or the 5 series cameras, and now the R5, from the EOS 1 series somewhat recently, at least generationally. They certainly were an option on my 1D Mark III back in 2007, but they didn't make it to the 5D line until the 5D Mark IV. Now, I'm sure there's probably some professional application where these make a lot of sense, but outside of maybe a locked down studio camera, I'm at a loss as to what that is. So if you use these settings in your day-to-day work, or maybe even not day-to-day work, leave a comment and let me know why. Now, I have to admit, this wasn't all that exciting as far as these videos have gone. And honestly, I'm not even sure if there's really any secret or hidden feature here that nobody knew about. That said, I do personally use the same exposure for new aperture and restrict shooting modes in something other than the default settings, and thought they might be useful to others. But to the extent of the rest of the settings, well, they kind of feel like cruft that's just been carried over from older cameras. Though, maybe I shouldn't say that, since having the options feels like it's better to me than not having them at all. Anyway, that's the Custom Function 2 menu page. If you found this useful or at least a little bit interesting, let me know by hitting the like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, hit that subscribe button too. Remember, you can't forget to unsubscribe later if you don't subscribe now. Also, if you happen to know someone who might find this useful, please consider sharing it. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.